Eliza and Mark Wilson were the epitome of stability for the small town of Newgrave. Their two-story home, framed by a white picket fence and a meticulously tended garden, radiated the kind of harmony everyone in the neighborhood admired. Together, they had spent 35 years navigating life's joys and challenges, raising two children who had grown up and moved out to build lives of their own. Eliza, the ever-dedicated homemaker, embodied calmness and care, her warm smile and willingness to lend an ear, earning her the affection of all who knew her. Mark, a highly respected architect, worked for a prestigious firm, ensuring that their family never wanted for anything. The local residents viewed the couple with both admiration and envy. They seemed like the perfect team, their bond built on mutual understanding and trust. Among their closest acquaintance was their neighbor, Michelle, who lived just across the street. Michelle, a vibrant woman in her early 30s, was always cheerful and polite. She lived alone and appeared genuinely captivated by the Wilsons' family life. Eliza often invited her over for lunch, and the two spent many evenings sipping tea on the terrace, discussing life. Eliza even confided in Michelle, sharing her deepest thoughts, grateful to have someone she could talk to. But small details began to unsettle Eliza. Michelle started visiting their home more frequently than a typical neighbor might. Her jokes and casual touches in Mark's presence felt increasingly natural, almost too much so. At first, Eliza dismissed these thoughts as a product of her imagination. After all, why would she have reason to doubt? Michelle was her friend, someone she trusted, and Mark was the man she had known for decades. Yet a growing unease began to take root. Things changed when silence crept into the house. The once lively dinner conversations grew brief, and Mark's gaze seemed distant. Eliza tried to convince herself it was just stress from work, but her intuition whispered otherwise. What had seemed like a picture-perfect life started to feel like an illusion, an image carefully constructed for those on the outside. She couldn't foresee what lay ahead, but something in Mark's and Michelle's behavior made her feel that this illusion could shatter at any moment, leaving only ruins in its wake. Eliza had always taken pride in the stability and predictability of her life. But recently, something had shifted, and it troubled her more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. Her husband Mark, the man she had always considered her unwavering rock, had begun to behave differently. At first it was little things. He started staying late at work more often, explaining it away with urgent client meetings or the need to finish a project. Liza tried not to dwell on it. Mark had always been devoted to his profession, and she had no reason to mistrust him. But as these late nights, became more frequent, her unease began to grow. One evening left a particularly lasting impression on her. Mark returned home later than usual, and when Eliza embraced him in the kitchen, she caught a faint but unfamiliar scent of perfume. It wasn't his cologne, nor was it hers. When she asked where he had been, he gave a short response. A client invited me to dinner. It was at some new restaurant, and the place was a bit stuffy. His explanation seemed reasonable, but something in his tone stirred a strange feeling inside her. For the first time in their decades together, Eliza felt he was hiding something. Over the next few days, she tried to push these thoughts away, convincing herself that she was overreacting. But one small detail after another began to weave a disquieting pattern. Mark suddenly became more protective of his phone. He used to leave it lying around the house, on the kitchen table in the living room, but now he kept it with him at all times. When it rang, he would answer quickly and leave the room. Eliza also noticed that his work calendar, which had always been open for her to see, had become more cryptic. No more mentions of clients or projects. Adding to her discomfort, Michelle started appearing more frequently in their lives. She no longer stopped by just for tea. Now she was often seen talking to Mark in the yard or catching him on the street. One morning, as Mark rushed out the door to work, he accidentally left his notebook on the kitchen counter. It was an old journal where he typically jotted down appointments and ideas for architectural projects. Eliza stared at it for a long time, debating whether she should look inside. Eventually, her curiosity got the better of her. The first few pages were harmless enough, notes about work calls and design sketches. But as she flipped further, her heart began to race. Several entries about evening meetings coincided with the days Mark had stayed late. Beside the dates was a name, Michelle. Eliza didn't know what to think. Why was Mark writing down their neighbor's name in his planner? Could it be a simple coincidence? She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought that this wasn't just happenstance gnawed at her. She remembered Michelle recently mentioning a new restaurant she really enjoyed. It was the same restaurant Mark had referred to when he mentioned his dinner with a client. The days passed, and Eliza felt her suspicions morph into an almost tangible weight. She tried to talk to Mark, but he dismissed her concerns, saying she was overthinking things. The uncertainty began to consume her daily life. Eliza knew she had to uncover the truth, but how could she do so without alerting Mark? Each night, lying in bed beside her husband, she replayed their 35 years together, now in a different light. Her doubts no longer felt unfounded. They were like a thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire fabric of their life together. Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that her seemingly perfect world was beginning to crack. Ever since she found the entries in Mark's notebook, peace had abandoned her. She could no longer convince herself that it was just coincidence or her imagination. At the same time, she knew she needed real evidence before she could confront him. This became her new mission. Every move Mark made and every word Michelle spoke now filled her with tension. Eliza decided her next steps had to be cautious and deliberate. Any careless action could reveal her suspicions. One day while Mark was at work, Eliza decided to conduct a thorough search of their home. She started with his desk. The drawers were half empty, most of the documents relating to his work. Blueprints, contracts, invoices. But in one drawer, buried beneath a stack of old papers, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a hotel receipt from a nearby town. The date on it matched one of the days Mark claimed to have been on a business trip. His name was on the reservation, but the venue didn't seem like the kind of place suited for a professional meeting. Eliza stared at the receipt for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Could this really be proof of her worst fears? That same evening, Michelle stopped by for a visit. She was her usual cheerful self, chatting about local news and casually mentioning that she recently had lunch at a restaurant with a wonderful atmosphere. She remarked that the restaurant had just opened, and Eliza suddenly recalled it was the same restaurant Mark had mentioned when he talked about his dinner with a client. Though Michelle's words seemed lighthearted, Eliza's heart sank. She was now almost certain that the two of them were spending more time together than they let on. Eliza realized she needed more proof to confirm the truth. She decided to check Mark's phone, even though she felt guilty for doing so. Late that night, after Mark had fallen asleep, she took his phone, grateful he hadn't set a password. She began scrolling through his messages. At first, everything appeared normal. Work-related conversations, light-hearted exchanges with colleagues. But then she found a chat with Michelle. Her hands trembled as she read through the messages. Nothing was explicit, but every message carried an undertone. Phrases like, "I had such a wonderful time and can't wait for our next meeting," only deepened her suspicions. Her eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to keep reading to the very end. The next day, as Mark left for work as usual, Eliza felt like she could no longer suppress her emotions. All the evidence she had collected, the hotel receipt, the messages, the unsettling coincidences, now painted a clear picture. Her heart ached, caught between the need to confront the truth and the fear of confirming what she already suspected. Throughout the day, she wrestled with how to proceed. The pain was unbearable, but she also felt a newfound determination. She thought back to all the moments she had trusted Mark, the times she had supported him and stood by his side. Now she was convinced that trust had been broken. But before confronting him, she decided she needed even more undeniable proof. She had to ensure that Mark wouldn't have any way to explain his way out of it. Eliza understood that this path would be painful, but there was no turning back. Eliza knew that accusations without solid proof could backfire on her. She could no longer look at Mark without feeling a pang of pain, but she also understood that his calm demeanor and dismissive attitude might work against her if she confronted him too soon. She decided to maintain the appearance of normalcy while quietly observing and analyzing. Her goal was clear, to gather irrefutable evidence. Yet the task proved more difficult than she had anticipated. To make sense of what was happening, Eliza started tracking Mark's schedule meticulously. She even kept a notebook where she recorded his every move, when he left the house, when he came home, what he said, and how he behaved. It might have seemed paranoid to an outsider, but for her, it was a way to regain some semblance of control. During the first few days, nothing unusual happened. But one morning, something caught her attention. She noticed Mark whispering cautiously into his phone while standing on the terrace. Her suspicions flared once more, but she couldn't get close enough to overhear without exposing herself. A few days later, Eliza decided to take things further. One morning after Mark left for work, she went to a cafe near his office. It was a place they used to visit together back when things weren't so strained. She picked a seat in a corner that offered a clear view of the entire room. At first, it felt like she was wasting her time. Mark wasn't there. But suddenly, her heart skipped a beat. Mark walked in, and he wasn't alone. Michelle was with him. The two sat at a table near the window. Their behavior wasn't overtly intimate, but it was undeniably more than friendly. Mark leaned toward Michelle, occasionally touching her hand, while she responded with the warmth that Eliza recognized all too well, one she herself had once shared with him. Eliza felt a tightness in her chest as she tried to remain hidden behind her menu. She couldn't stop watching them. Every gesture, every look between them seemed like another brick in the wall of evidence she was building against Mark. When they left the cafe together, Eliza waited a moment before following. She watched as they got into Mark's car and drove away. It was another detail that cemented her growing certainty. The following day, Eliza began discreetly asking questions of their neighbors. She didn't want to be too direct, so she framed her inquiries carefully. "Have you seen much of Mark lately? He's been so busy with work." One neighbor, an older man named Henry, said something that sent a chill through her. "Oh yes, I saw him last week over at Michelle's. I figured they were discussing something, maybe a renovation. But wasn't he supposed to be at work then?" Henry's comment was yet another blow. Eliza began to realize that all her fears were becoming undeniable reality. Even the neighbors couldn't ignore the connection between Mark and Michelle. At home, Mark became increasingly withdrawn. He almost never left his phone unattended anymore, and it seemed like he was trying harder to hide something. At dinner, he avoided meeting her eyes, and his answers to her questions grew short and distant. His attempts at secrecy only served to confirm what Eliza already felt. She understood now. The time had come to take her next step. Eliza spent days gathering her thoughts before summoning the courage to do what she felt was necessary. She couldn't let her suspicions fester any longer, but she also knew she couldn't act recklessly. Her caution was understandable. After 35 years of marriage, every step felt fraught with risk. However, the evidence she had uncovered left no room for doubt. After several sleepless nights, Eliza made up her mind to confront Michelle directly, her closest neighbor and, until recently, a friend. That evening seemed like the perfect opportunity. Mark was working late, and Michelle's house appeared quiet with no sign of visitors. Eliza climbed the stairs to her front door, knocked, and waited. Michelle answered almost immediately. The woman who usually radiated confidence and cheer now looked slightly startled at the sight of Eliza. Eliza stepped inside, taking in the neat, thoughtfully decorated interior of Michelle's home. Everything was perfectly arranged, but to Eliza, the polished surroundings felt like order and beauty masking something far more complicated beneath. Michelle, while attempting to maintain her usual composure, was visibly uneasy. Anyone watching her closely would have noticed the slight nervousness in her movements. Eliza decided not to waste time on pleasantries. She laid out her suspicions plainly, presenting the evidence she had gathered: the hotel receipt, the text messages, and the times she had seen Michelle and Mark together. Michelle's reaction was mixed. At first, she denied everything, trying to deflect Eliza's accusations. But Eliza's calm, unwavering tone and the mounting evidence eventually broke through her defenses. As Eliza methodically laid out one detail after another, Michelle's demeanor shifted, from denial to quiet resignation. Finally, she admitted to the truth. She and Mark had been involved in an affair. Michelle confessed that the relationship had been going on for over 10 years. She explained that it had started by chance but had grown into an emotional dependency over time. Her admission was concise, without excessive detail, but it was enough to confirm everything Eliza had feared. The doubts that had haunted her for weeks were now a devastating reality. For Eliza, the revelation was shattering. The realization that her husband had been engaged in such a long-standing betrayal with someone she considered a friend changed her perspective on everything she had thought was stable in her life. Michelle, for her part, seemed overwhelmed with guilt. She made no attempts to justify her actions, But her explanations made it clear that this relationship had been deeper and longer lasting than Eliza could have ever imagined. The confrontation was quiet but charged with tension. There were no raised voices, no dramatic outbursts, just a heavy, palpable silence filled with the weight of betrayal. Eliza remained composed, even deliberate, while Michelle, having realized there was no way to escape the truth, surrendered entirely. The meeting ended without further explanations. Eliza left Michelle's home, leaving behind the shattered remains of trust. Outside, the night was calm, the air still except for the faint rustle of trees along the street. Her footsteps were steady, but her heart felt unbearably heavy. She returned home with the certainty that her life would never be the same again. Back in her house, Michelle sat alone, staring at the floor. The silence of her home became unbearable as guilt pressed down on her like a crushing weight. In that moment, she understood that her role in Mark and Eliza's life was over. With every passing minute, she became more aware that her actions could no longer be hidden from the scrutiny of others. Eliza returned to her own home, knowing that she would now have to find the strength to face this new, painful reality and move forward. Eliza returned home after her conversation with Michelle, entirely consumed by her thoughts. Michelle's confession had obliterated any lingering doubts. Everything now fell into place. The late nights, Mark's guarded behavior with his phone, the moments he avoided meeting her gaze. The life she had built over 35 years now felt like a fragile house of cards, brought down in an instant. A storm of emotions swirled within her, betrayal, anger, and heartbreak. She knew she couldn't continue living as if nothing had changed. That evening, Eliza made the decision to stop staying silent. She gathered all the evidence she had, the hotel receipt, the screenshots of Mark and Michelle's messages, and even the notes she had meticulously recorded about his strange behavior. She didn't plan to yell or cry. She intended to present everything to him calmly and force him to confront the truth. Mark came home later than usual that night, close to 10 o'clock. His demeanor was as calm as always, as if nothing unusual had happened. He entered the living room, greeted Eliza, and began to take off his coat. But Eliza, who had been waiting for him while sitting in an armchair, didn't respond to his casual, "How was your day?" Instead, she silently rose, walked to the coffee table, and placed the evidence in front of him. Mark froze when he saw the receipts and printed messages. For a moment, his face was unreadable, but then a flicker of something, shock, guilt, perhaps fear, crossed his expression. He quickly regained his composure. "What is this?" he asked, attempting to maintain his usual calm tone. Eliza's voice was steady, but her words cut sharply. "This is the truth. Your truth. The one you've been hiding all these years." Mark tried to deny everything at first. He stammered, offering vague explanations, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. He said Michelle was exaggerating and that their relationship had been strictly friendly or professional. But Eliza was unmoved. Her patience had run out. She had already heard the truth from Michelle, and Mark's attempts to deflect responsibility only made her anger grow. "You can't lie to me anymore," she said coldly. Her voice didn't waver, but there was a steely determination behind it. Realizing there was no escaping the confrontation, Mark changed tactics. His tone shifted as he began to make excuses. He spoke of stress at work, of how his connection with Michelle had been a mistake, something that had gotten out of hand. But Eliza could see through his words. She knew he wasn't truly remorseful. He was only trying to protect himself. The tension in the room grew heavier with each passing moment. Mark stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch her hand, but Eliza instinctively took a step back. In that moment, the flood of emotions she had been holding back finally erupted. Her voice rose as she unleashed all her pain about the betrayal, the lies, and the years of trust he had shattered. Mark, sensing there was nothing he could say to fix this, fell silent. He stopped trying to justify his actions, merely standing there and listening as Eliza's words poured out like a storm. His silence only fueled her anger further, a bitter reminder of how distant and unresponsive he had become. Then, in the heat of the moment, Eliza lost control. Overwhelmed by rage and heartbreak, she grabbed a nearby vase and, without fully realizing what she was doing, swung it at Mark. The impact left him reeling and he fell to the floor. The room fell into a sudden, deafening silence. Eliza froze, staring at the scene before her. The vase slipped from her hands and landed on the carpet with a dull thud. In her mind, one word echoed endlessly: the end. She took a shaky step back, her heart pounding as the weight of her actions sank in. After a long, agonizing pause, she reached for the phone and called the police. Her voice was eerily calm as she confessed what had just happened. That night, Eliza Wilson's life changed forever. The police arrived at the Wilsons' home within minutes of Eliza's call. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet, deserted street, casting an eerie glow on the tidy neighborhood. Newgrave was the kind of town where news traveled faster than official announcements. As the sound of sirens pierced the stillness, neighbors began peeking out their windows, trying to figure out what had happened. Soon, whispers and speculations spread like wildfire. What could have possibly occurred in the seemingly perfect Wilson household? Eliza sat waiting for the officers in the living room, her hands folded in her lap and her gaze fixed on the floor. Eliza made no effort to defend herself or evade responsibility. When the officers entered the house, she stood up, extended her hands toward them, and said, "I did it." Her voice was calm but hollow, devoid of emotion, as if all her energy had been drained. The paramedics who arrived alongside the police quickly examined Mark and transported him to the hospital. His condition was critical, but the medics confirmed he was still alive. Meanwhile, Eliza was taken into custody without resistance. She seemed too exhausted to fight back. Or perhaps she had already accepted the inevitability of her actions. By the next morning, the entire town of Newgrave knew the details of the event. In the local cafe, at the market, and even in the post office queue, everyone was talking about how the perfect Wilson family had become the center of a scandal. Neighbors shared their theories, some recalling how quiet and withdrawn Eliza had seemed lately, others remarking that Mark had appeared unusually busy in recent months. But the most shocking revelation was the involvement of Michelle, who quickly packed her belongings and left town shortly after the incident. Her house now stood empty, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a deafening silence. In custody, Eliza refused to hire a lawyer. She provided the police with a detailed statement describing everything that had transpired, from the first seeds of suspicion to the fateful confrontation. She withheld nothing and made no attempt to shift the blame onto anyone else. Her confession became the cornerstone of the case, yet she showed no regret for her actions. Mark, after spending several weeks in the hospital, was eventually discharged with significant injuries. He refused to comment on the situation and avoided contact with anyone outside his legal team. His reputation, like his marriage, had been irreparably damaged. He made only rare appearances in town, and his presence was met with awkward silences from the neighbors. His refusal to address what had happened only fueled the growing rumors, which became increasingly exaggerated with each retelling. Eliza's trial began 2 months after the incident. Her court-appointed lawyer emphasized her emotional state, arguing that she had acted under immense psychological pressure. But this did little to sway the judge's decision. The verdict was clear: 20 years in prison for an assault that had nearly turned fatal. Gradually, they returned to their routines, leaving the Wilsons' story to exist as little more than whispers and gossip. For Eliza, however, it was just the beginning of a new and isolated chapter in her life, one defined by reflection, regret, and solitude. Mark, once recovered, filed for divorce immediately after the trial. He sold the house where he and Eliza had spent over 3 decades together and used the money to relocate to a city several states away. Although he continued working as an architect, the scandal surrounding his personal life had tarnished his reputation, and trust among his clients was never fully restored. Michelle, now branded as the catalyst for the Wilsons' downfall, vanished from Newgrave before the trial even began. Her home was sold, and she was never seen in the town again. Some neighbors speculated that she had moved in with family, while others believed she had started over somewhere far away. Regardless, her name became taboo in Newgrave. No one wanted to speak of the woman who had played a role in unraveling the Wilsons family. Newgrave, initially abuzz with discussions about the tragedy, eventually returned to its usual rhythm. The neighbors who had once admired the Wilsons' seemingly perfect marriage avoided the topic altogether. The incident remained a lingering memory, a quiet reminder of how fragile appearances could be. After her sentencing, Eliza Wilson was transferred to a state correctional facility. 20 years of imprisonment felt like a life sentence in solitude, with no hope of returning to her former life. The days when she was a wife, a mother, and the keeper of a warm, loving home now felt like distant, almost unreal memories. In prison, time stretched endlessly. Her cell, the drab uniform, and the monotony of days and nights created the illusion that life had come to a standstill. Her children, Thomas and Claire, distanced themselves almost immediately after the verdict. They struggled to reconcile their image of the mother they once adored with the woman who had committed such a vehement act. Neither of them visited her in prison or maintained any meaningful contact. Thomas, the elder of the two, tried to reason with Claire, saying that their mother had been a victim of her own emotions, but Claire refused to listen. To her, it was simple. A person capable of such violence could no longer be trusted. Both siblings moved to new cities, determined to leave their past behind. For Eliza, life in prison became a time of deep reflection. She thought endlessly about the moments that had led to her downfall, moments where, perhaps, she could have stopped the tragedy from unfolding. She wondered if confronting Mark earlier or choosing a different path might have changed the outcome. She replayed her marriage, her relationship with her children, and the night everything fell apart. The hardest part was knowing she could never undo what had been done. To cope with the isolation, Eliza turned to writing. Her journals became a space for her to confess her thoughts, to reflect on love, betrayal, and how powerful emotions could drive even the most rational person to do the unthinkable. She didn't write to seek sympathy or justify her actions. Instead, her writing became a testament to how easily the solid foundations of life could crumble when faced with unspoken truths. Years later, a journalist researching crimes committed in the heat of passion came across Eliza's story. The article that followed gained wide attention, but the publicity mattered little to Eliza. She didn't seek fame or pity. Her only wish was for her children to one day understand that even a terrible mistake did not erase the love and care she had given them throughout their lives. The Wilsons' house, long abandoned, remained a silent and haunting figure in Newgrave. For the townspeople, it stood as a somber reminder of how polished exteriors could conceal deep cracks, which, left unattended, would inevitably cause the entire structure to collapse. Though life in Newgrave carried on, the memory of the Wilson family lingered, a quiet shadow that refused to fade, a lasting reminder of how easily the illusion of perfection could be shattered.